Michael Northcott wants to know who's more likely to become America's Hitler, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, or some yet undiscovered future candidate who will rise up after the next worldwide financial crisis. Well, look, Bernie Sanders is more likely to become a Nazi Hitler than Donald Trump is, because even though Donald Trump is a very confident kind of, charismatic kind of guy, he's basically a businessman, and basically the businessman philosophy, at least on Donald Trump level, if you can get a little help from the government, great, but basically, go out there and make some money and so on. Bernie Sanders' entire philosophy is based on collectivism, and Hitler was a collectivist, and Stalin was a collectivist, and Mao was a collectivist. They always want to split hairs. Well, Hitler he wasn't a socialist. Okay. As a matter of fact, the future that Bernie wants for America is much more like Nazism than communism, because in communism there is no private property. What Bernie wants is the government to control private property, which is National Socialism. And when Bernie talks about bringing socialism to America, I'm so tempted to do this. You mean kind of like a national socialism, kind of an American, like a socialism for the whole country, like a national socialism, and watch all these students go, yeah. And then imagine their surprise. But look, Bernie Sanders isn't going to become Hitler. And it's not just because the American people haven't suffered the humiliations that the Germans did. The American people are much more tolerant than the Germans ever were, because we're composed of so many different people. But much more importantly, and this just needs to be said, Bernie Sanders is not going to become America's Hitler, because Bernie Sanders isn't Hitler. Bernie Sanders, as I say, I don't think he's a particularly nice guy. He doesn't seem to have a good reputation with his staff. But Bernie Sanders is not a man who's just possessed with hatred and evil. I mean, he wants to redistribute the wealth. He's never had a job in his life. But this isn't a kind of guy who wrote a book when he was 25 about, exterminating people. He's just, he's not nearly that psychopathic. And you have to have a whole bunch of psychopaths. The Democrats are not Nazis. They're heading for National Socialism, but they're not Nazis in the way that we understand the word. It's a much, much better thing to think of them as the mafia. It's a giant racket. As Dinesh D'Souza said in Stealing America, it's like, if you're going to be a thief, what's the most valuable thing in the world? Turns out the most valuable thing in the world is the private property held by the American people. It's $71 trillion. That's rather a large heist. And so that's really what they are. They're about stealing. They're not about extermination. Now downstream, of course, once you vote these people into power and once you stop the idea of individualism, I'm going to go do some more colleges. I'm going to set up a bunch of questions. They're not going to sound like trick questions, but I want to get them on record. And one of them is, do you think that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few? I know it's a Star Trek quote, but I'm going to ask him. Should we always do what more people want? And if they're socialists, they'll say yes. Because I'll set it up, say, well, what about these guys? They're these billionaires. They don't have a voice? No. You're just saying they're outnumbered, they're outvoted. You're going to just take their stuff by force because you've got more votes than they do? Yep. Well, if that's the world we're going to live in, then what happens if somebody says that they don't particularly like the Jews and we want to take all their stuff? What's going to protect them? Or we don't particularly like students who come from the University of New Hampshire. Let's say that the Republicans have an armed revolution with all of our guns, and we set up a government and we say, hey, you social justice weenies, we don't want you around anymore. And we outvote you, so off you go. Then you say, what would protect you? And the answer is your civil rights would protect you. But if you're going to be talking about taking people's money and stealing it, then what civil rights do you have? In other words, if you have the right to take something from somebody punitively, the guy's got $1 billion, we're going to take it and give it to somebody else by force through the state. Then what's to stop the state from doing anything else? Does this guy have rights? Yes or no? Does he have a force field around him or her that protects not just their property, but their rights, their freedoms, and everything. Do they have that force field around them? Yes or no? Because if it comes down to vote, what's that old line? Democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. These are the kind of things that these people never hear, and that's what causes them to grind their gears. They really are, on some level. They're just like Bambi. They're just so... You can even make the case they're just really innocent. They just don't know any better. Their teachers have led them on this kind of thing. Okay. Let's see here. I can probably do this one pretty quick, too. Zachariah Timmons again. Is there such a thing as an authoritarian right or a libertarian left? Why have these terms become popular? Yes, there is such a thing as an authoritarian right. I don't think there's such a thing as a libertarian left. Modern leftism is collectivism. It's collectivism. It's redistributing wealth. It's big, powerful state. It's single-payer health care. It's government intrusion into everything. Ever more government, ever more state, ever more regulations, ever more taxes. You can't be a progressive and be a libertarian at the same time. Progressivism is about taking away people's freedom and their money and distributing it to other people. You cannot possibly be a leftist libertarian, or a progressive libertarian anyway, because those two terms are actually genuinely antithetical to each other. But you can have an authoritarian right. I mean, you can have a world where conservatives try to enforce their values on people legislatively, and you could make the case that that's what happened with gay marriage. I'm not going to open up this entire can of worms, but to put it quickly, this philosophy of modern conservatism that I've become a part of and that I believe in is coherent and consistent. And if we're saying that the government needs to get out of people's private lives, then the government needs to get out of their private lives. And that means I don't care. It doesn't affect me. It may offend me, and I may think that it's bad for society, and a lot of people make the case that it is in fact the end of society in terms of its structure, and I think those people have got a pretty good point. But it's not the government's job to legislate it. That's a fight that has to be fought in the culture. It needs to be fought in the culture. So, but you can obviously imagine a world where every now and then, you just don't see much of it. I'm trying to think of an example of this kind of authoritarian conservatism, right-wing stuff, and I just can't really think of anything. You get like the moral majority, that was 20, 30 years ago, and even those people were not really saying we want to do this by force. So generally speaking, I don't think you can be a progressive and a libertarian. I think those terms are antithetical. You can be a conservative who's so rigid, but then they're not really conservative by the definition that I have of conservative. So anyway, that was just a kind of a fun little thing. I don't want to spend any more time on that. 2 to go. Michael Northcott says, what's a less morally objectionable and unrealistic way to reform the electoral system? Making it so that only property owners can vote, or adopting the original form of democracy where offices were assigned by lot? It's called sortition. The argument for only being able to vote if you have property actually is a very good argument. I don't support it, but it's a good argument. And the argument is that if you only allowed people with property to vote, then they would not be inclined or need to vote themselves money out of the treasury. In other words, if you had property, you were established, you were somewhat successful, and if you wanted to raise taxes, the taxes would be raised on you. And if you wanted to put in an income tax, it would be an income tax on you. And if you wanted to soak the rich and do all these things to destroy individual freedom, the persons that would be suffering would be you. By eliminating that and making sure that everybody has one vote, one person, one vote, which is not something the Democrats believe in. The Democrats vote 6, 7 times, and they're proud of it. But one person, one vote, you can reach a point, and de Tocqueville warned about this 250 years ago. There comes a point when people can vote themselves money out of the treasury. and we're at that point and past it. So that would be the argument for property holders, but I can't buy that argument. I mean, my rights are my rights, and my right to vote is part of my natural law right to be governed with my consent, and it shouldn't be predicated on anything. There's no predication on my right to free speech. There's no predication on my right to bear arms. There's no predication on any of that. So needless to say, this idea of having to be a landowner in order to vote, I don't agree with. But the problem needs to be addressed. The problem of people voting themselves other people's money needs to be addressed. One way you address it is by following the Constitution, but that's been long gone, because the Constitution says, promote the general welfare. That is a clause I would like to have seen taken, just never written. But the definition of general welfare is something that benefits everybody. The interstate highway system benefits everybody. That's what the federal government's supposed to do. Taking money from you to give it to me is not general welfare. That's my welfare. And as I've said before, by the way, that's why they named the giant redistribution scheme, why they called it welfare. That's why they gave it the name, welfare. Are you on welfare? Yes. Why? Because it says right here in the Constitution, promote the welfare. They just play these kind of tricks all the time. So what do you do about this? I don't think you can do anything. You can't deprive people of their right to vote. It's natural law. It's a God-given law that they're born with. It's a right that they're born with. You can't take it away from them. You can do. Here's what you can do, and we better do it quick. You can flat tax them, or you can sales tax them, and that way, everybody's got the same skin in the game. And I'm not going to get into flat tax or fair tax or sales tax or anything, but if everybody paid the same tax, and I mean everybody paid the same tax, then everybody would have skin in the game, and everybody would have a vote. And furthermore, and this isn't mentioned very often, if the government was to make all of its money off of a sales tax, the federal government, then the government would be, in fact, motivated to get out of the way of business, because the more business that happens, the more money the federal government has, and the less business that happens, the less money the federal government has. If you had a sales tax as a means of funding this government, then everybody'd be paying the same. If we wanted to raise the taxes, they'd be raised on everybody, and everybody has skin in the game, and the government has skin in the game, too. The government revenues are coming from sales. The more economy there is, the more economic activity there is, the more money the government gets to do their little things with, like shut down economies. So, yeah, there is a solution, but the solution is not the requirement to hold property. And then the other thing about, selection, random selection of people. I think I speak for just about everybody in this country when I say at this point, if you want to just randomly run the phone book, as William F. Buckley famously said, he'd rather be governed by the first 475 people in the Boston phone book than the clowns we have now. But that's only because the system is really so badly broken. If you were electing people and they did the way it was supposed to, businessman goes to Washington, he's got a problem. He's trying to fix a problem. Maybe the sidewalk in his neighborhood is not good, or whatever. He goes to Washington, he does 2 years or 6 or whatever, and then he goes home because he's obsolete now. His experience is obsolete. Then you would actually get good people, and then the whole system would be working. But again, it's kind of the same kind of people that are drawn to socialism are drawn to government work and politics, right? The vast invisible bureaucracy. And then there's also immortal bureaucracy. And then there's politicians who want to get in for life because it's life work. It's make millions of dollars. Harry Reid's made millions of dollars as a public servant. That somehow has happened. So has Hillary Clinton, made hundreds of millions of dollars. And this is for people who are not smart enough to go out and get your money the honest way by persuading you to part with it.